Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about Commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz, and I'm joined by my fantastic co-hosts. Up first, he cannot wait to do the Final Fantasy side quest of catching a fish here in Magic. It's Matt Morgan.
So my partner thinks that I don't give her enough privacy, or at least that's what she said in her diary. I don't know. Sometimes she's kind of hard to read.
Matt, no, bonk, bad.
It's only a joke. I respect privacy. I go to a different level just to go to the bathroom even. That's how much I respect privacy.
Oh my word, this was so silly. All right, up next, he saw that Matt was struggling with that side quest of catching a fish, so he decided to gift a tapped fish. It's Dana Roach.
I finally realized why all these billionaires in the U.S. are so obsessed with space travel. A guillotine doesn't work in zero gravity.
Dana's got a brand new theme to his jokes in 2025, and honestly, I'm here for it.
This is not intentional. I just happened to do this 2 times in a row.
Oh, no, are you kidding? I go off, King. I absolutely love it. All right. Matt, what is it that we're talking about in this week's episode, bro?
So we've finally gotten a chance to look at the bracket system a little bit, see it in execution, play with it a few times, and we just want to kind of report in our early feedback and see what our first impressions are with the new Commander bracket system.
We've even got a little bit of data to share about the distribution of where people are placing those brackets too, so that'll be interesting to get into some feedback for Wizards of the Coast in terms of how this bracket system could evolve that we would like to share with everybody. Should be a really interesting discussion, but we got some shout outs to do before we dive into it.
We are excited to be teamed up with Dragon Shield. Their sleeves come in dozens of colors or art variants. Their sleeve crafter tool at dragonshield.com is an excellent way to let you design personalized sleeves for your Magic collection. If you were at MagicCon Chicago, you might have gotten a chance to see our personalized EDHRECast sleeves, or even gotten a box yourself at the live event we had on Sunday. And if you click on the link in the description below, you'll get 5% off any Dragon Shield product. It makes your purchase is cheaper and it supports the show. Dragon Shield, your deck's personal force field.
And if you'd like to support the show, there's lots of ways you can do that, whether it's liking this video, subscribing on YouTube, leaving comments, all those ways that you can do that for free. But if you would like to, you can head over to patreon.com/EDHRECast, getting something in return for your monetary support at Patreon, like, I don't know, joining our patron-only Discord. It's a great way to, find a game. If you don't have a good LGS that you can get games in routinely, it is popping over there. It's a great way to get some games in and support the show in the process. And there's a tier where you can get yourself in the running to be the patron of the week, where you get a very special shout out. And so this week we are going to give that shout out over to Aaron DeChant. I'm assuming it's Aaron DeChant, actually. So we're going to chant your praises and how much we appreciate you going over to patreon.com/EDHRECast. So Aaron, thank you so much for all of your support.
Heck yeah, Aaron, thank you so much for your support. Thank you to all of our patrons. Okay, guys, let's get into our show here. We have some feedback about the brackets now that we've actually gotten a little bit more time to properly use this system. And again, for those not familiar, we will link all of the videos that we've done, including our interview with Gavin Verhey about what the bracket system is. But Matt, as you mentioned, yeah, we did actually get some more proper chances to use this system in person. And to start things off, let's just go over our initial impressions with how it's been going so far.
So I think I played about a dozen games in Chicago, and I've played probably roughly 12 to 15 more at my LGS here in town. My experiences have been pretty good with it so far. The one thing that has really jumped out at me is people who use the brackets as a tool in addition to a pregame conversation. Everything works really, really well when you're like, oh, this is bracket 2. And then you add additional conversation beyond that versus people who just would tell you what the bracket is and there's nothing else added to the conversation.
Yeah.
That was a night and day difference. When it was used as a tool, in addition to what people were doing, it worked really well. When people were using that exclusively, then we ran into some inconsistencies. So at least that's been my experience so far. Matt, what did you run into when you were doing this?
So I've had a pretty similar experience overall, but I've had kind of two separate areas where I've gotten to see this in play. MagicCon Chicago, all three of us were there. And I think people were very excited because the overly invested player base is the type that's going to go to it. So they're paying more attention to stuff like the new Commander bracket system. They're a little more plugged in online. I went to my LGS a few times, and I went with one of our moderators for our patron Discord. So she and I went to an LGS, and they were barely aware that it happened. So they had talked a little bit about like, oh, well, they might be unbanning some cards soon. And that was their entire takeaway. There was no other mention of brackets in the 2 different Saturdays that we went and played since the Commander bracket thing had happened. So it's really interesting seeing just how different the reception has been depending on where you go.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. Still trying to get the message out is a big part of this push. Because, this is still in beta.
Definitely,
it's possible that the reach it has will be a little bit different when it is officially announced. To echo what you guys are saying, my impressions of it have so far leaned or erred more towards the positive as well. The very first time that I encountered anyone talking about brackets in the wild, someone said, I don't think I have a deck that's below a bracket 4. And immediately I was like, oh, I know exactly what deck I'm going to bring out then. And what a breeze. That made it very, very easy to glide through. If there has been any difficulty, for me, it is closer to the distance between like what makes a bracket 2, as they say, the average precon level versus the upgraded bracket where you have up to that number of game changer. If there's any space for misunderstandings, that is mostly the place for me that I've seen it be a little bit more shaky or wibbly wobbly. So there's more to be fleshed out there. And we have ideas that we might share later in this episode about things that could change to help glide through some of that a little bit more smoothly. But my initial impressions with it have erred towards the positive, where I was very, very much clued into, I do know what to expect here. And Dana, as you said, when people used it as an ingredient in the discussion rather than the entire discussion, night and day difference.
Yeah, like nothing went away with this bracket system. The tools we had previously existed. This was just a new tool. And in my mind, the more tools we have to facilitate these conversations, the better off we are. I don't think there's a downside to it. And when I've seen, people on Reddit, for example, that seem very against the bracket system make their posts, it feels like they're looking for a reason to get upset about having to have a conversation.
Yeah.
Because nothing's different than it was before. We've just gotten something new that you can add.
A note that you've put into the show notes here, Matt, is that this is a comma, not a period. And I love that as a way to describe this.
Yeah.
It is not definitive. And even when we look on deck building websites like Archidect, which are giving estimated brackets, they'll look at the deck and they're even cooperating with other websites like Commander Spellbook, which can measure 2-card infinite combos and things like that to try and figure out where your deck might lie. But even Archidect is like, this is an estimate. Like, do not take this necessarily as gospel. You are the one who makes the final call on this, because there are other things that this bracket system does not comprehensively get, because a 100% comprehensive system would be impossible. So like noting this is an estimate is a really big part of that. And yeah, just seems important to note there. I love your phrasing of this is a comma, not a period. Let's not treat it prescriptively. I love that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and I got a chance to sit down and talk with Gavin Verhey while we were at MagicCon Chicago, and it was a super brief conversation, but I asked him, what would you have done differently maybe about the announcement? And he did it say, fairly publicly, I kind of wish we would have done better at expressing that the brackets are here to help with the intent behind deck building, instead of this is what it is and this is a hard and fast rule. And he did kind of drive home in the announcement that this isn't meant to replace pregame conversations. This is meant to supplement it. But the intent was a big, big thing that kind of got lost in the messaging.
Very agreed. I find I actually prefer the graphic that Rachel Weeks and some other Commander Format panel members made more than I like the official Wizards graphic, precisely because of what you and Gavin talked about there. I think their image does a better job of putting that focus on deck intention, because too much focus on just game changers, for example, means that people will miss important details about other things that will place a deck in a specific zone. For instance, a characteristic of Bracket 3 Upgraded isn't just the presence of up to 3 game changers, but also that you have been very deliberate and intentional about each card choice in that deck. But that detail gets very overlooked with the original official Wizards image. So that is a critique that I agree with you and Gavin on for sure. If I may include another related critique, that area, Bracket 3, is the one that still seems to be the fuzziest too, and I would want to report to Wizards and to the Commander Format panel that the thing that we've seen the most comments about has been the current distance between Brackets 2 Core and Bracket 3 Upgraded. It feels to me, and apparently to many others out there, that there's a sizable leap between a modern Precon at Bracket 2 and a deck that's doing like Survival of the Fittest, Fierce Guardianship, Force of Will type of things. So there are some other knobs that could be tweaked to provide more clarity of experience, and if there is any area to focus on providing that clarity, that is the section that seems to need it the most. So of course, we'll talk about some possible wholesale alterations that could happen to the system and the ramifications of those possible changes, which ones may work or may not, including some cards that we think could become game changers as we get further on in this episode.
And I think we have some data actually that got pulled about what decks fall into what brackets and like which brackets are most common.
That we do. So we worked with Architect, which is also one of our favorite deck building tools, to collect data on how users are identifying their decks brackets. Architect has noted the results of over 64,000 decks in their database where users have themselves chosen the bracket that decks would fall into. And here we can share those results with you and check out the distribution of which brackets are the most or least populated. Always very exciting that on the show we get to be the first to share such cool new data with you all. As a quick note about this data that we're going to share, we are not using any figures that have been estimated by a deck building site or an algorithm. As we mentioned earlier, Architect has an awesome tool where when you put your deck into their site, it can estimate the bracket for you. It uses the presence not just of game changers or extra turns or mass lane denial, but it even identifies like 2-card infinite combos that could be present in your deck list to help you estimate what bracket your deck could be. And that's an amazing gift to give users, especially because Architect is so exceptionally clear that this is just an estimate. It is not a definitive prescriptive thing. So for clarity, for this data set here, we are not using estimates. We agree with Architect that the most important thing is how brewers themselves identify their deck intention. So making sure we understand the sample size here, being totally transparent, this is a population of 64,000 decks where the user chose their bracket. And we're excited to share the results and the distribution with everyone about how it all is shaken out.
Yeah, from the get-go, the first thing that shouldn't be surprising, because that's how these things usually break down, is the two brackets with the least representation are CEDH and Exhibition. So the first bracket and the fifth bracket, the two extreme ends of the spectrum, that are both at 4 to 5%. There's 4.1% of the decks are CEDH decks and 5.2 are Exhibition. I actually would have thought CEDH would have been higher than Exhibition.
Same.
But I'm not surprised that those are the least represented two brackets of the 5 available.
But I also think those might be the most reliable numbers, because I would wager you're not building bracket 5 CDH decks or bracket 1, the Exhibition just for funsies brackets. You're not doing that on accident. And so I think that the people that are self-diagnosing those two brackets might be the most accurate ways to find out just the population of those brackets for sure.
Yeah, one of the things that I have noticed people will say about, like, what's the difference between bracket 4 and 5? Because it does seem, when you just look at the original graphic, that like, oh, these seem to have exactly the same things on them. There's no differentiation, no restriction, right? And the difference is, if you don't know whether you're a bracket 5, you're not a bracket 5. If you know when you're playing CEDH, like that is a very conscious decision. It's a tournament metagame decision. So that is really a big difference that seems easy for people to self-report, as you were saying.
I think that applies a little bit too to how do you know if it's bracket 1 or bracket 2? Well, if you don't know, you're probably bracket 2. Bracket 1, you're intentionally, playing things on, whether it's like extreme devotion to a not very good theme or anything like that. I think bracket 1 also it's fairly intentional that you're if you don't know, you're just rounding up to brackets 2.
Moving to the other ones that make up a much bigger portion of this pie, core bracket 2, that's got nearly 29% of users there are going with a bracket 2 experience. And then the biggest slice of the pie is upgraded bracket 3 with 42% of the pie there. And then rounding things out, optimized is just about 20%. And that again is bracket 4. So whole bunch of numbers in there. Biggest one, 42%, is that bracket 3, up to 3 game changers in there. How are we feeling about these numbers? Do we think that this reflects our own deck distribution? Do we think this is a surprise? Where are you guys at?
Yeah, this makes sense. I have nothing in the first or the fifth bracket. I have nothing that I've intentionally designed to be weak enough to sit in bracket 1. I have nothing in the CEDH bracket at all. So all of my decks reside in 2, 3, or 4. And primarily in 2 or 3. And so my distribution of decks, at least among those 3 particular brackets, looks more or less the same as this, give or take. So yeah, this feels correct, at least based on my decks in how I would bracket them.
Yeah, the only surprise really is that almost 75% of the decks out there are brackets 2 and 3. I shouldn't be surprised, I guess. But really, yeah, I figured it would be a little bit more evenly spread out between 2, 3, and 4. Maybe because I know that a lot of players like to play very powerful things, but not 75% of the entire population, at least according to our Architect, is in brackets 2 and 3. That was a little surprising just how overly weighted it was, but I guess I probably shouldn't be, just by the nature of what we saw when we looked at game changer numbers back when the brackets were originally announced.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to cross-reference this new data with some other data that we've shared on previous episodes. We shared this when the game changers in the brackets were first announced, and this is data that our resident data scientist Julia compiled, where we saw that about 52% of decks out there in EDHREC, just the entire database, contain 0 game changers at all. So just over half contain 0 game changers. A combined 33% of decks contain anywhere from 1 to 3 game changer cards. So that is at least a third of Commander decks out there being at least a bracket 3, and that left approximately 15% of decks out there running 4 or more game changer cards, which means they are definitely at least a bracket 4 or a bracket 5.
Yeah, even having seen that original data, I was still a little bit surprised at bracket 4 being where it was. I would have assumed between, just accidentally running 4 different game changers, or having a handful of tutors, or having extra turn spells, or having 2-card combos. There was enough things that I felt like would just incidentally have put people's decks into bracket 4, and that doesn't seem to be the case. I thought that slice would be a little bit wider than it is, but it's not like unexpectedly small to me. Seeing it, I'm like, I can see that. It's not what I would have guessed, but it does make sense.
But I also am glad, so if the numbers line out, like you said, Joey, if only 15% of decks are running 4 or more game changers, but there's almost 20% of people are in bracket 4, that's a sign that people are reporting up. And so they're saying, well, yes, I don't have an explicit amount of game changers, but I still know this deck is a 4. I still know this deck is a 3. That's super encouraging to me that people are willing to go beyond just the raw number of game changers, and they're looking at the deck as a whole and how does that function. I very much am glad that is what the community is kind of coaching themselves up on.
I am 100% with you. That is a very encouraging figure to me as well. I think it is fair for us to point out that there is a self-selection bias here, though.
Sure, absolutely.
Again, this isn't us estimating. This isn't taking any estimated numbers. These are the people who have specifically self-reported, and that does mean it's a more actively online, more engaged, more invested type of audience member. This is an audience who would self-select. They are putting their deck lists online to nominate their decks in that type of way. I think that type of audience is probably more likely to have things in higher tiers, probably to have things that aren't just a precon, but things that are upgraded a bit. So that might be a reason why some of the numbers look the way they do. So that does play a bias here. But at the same time, Matt, I am just as heartened as you are. I think it does match up with exactly what you said. People are reporting up, and that is encouraging to me. That is exactly what I want to see, because people reporting down and trying to cheat the system is just not what this is about, and it kind of sucks.
I have seen a little bit of the cheating of the system, the people saying, well, by letter of the law, this is brackets 2 because I have no game changers. I've definitely have seen some of that happening, and the gamification of it, but it looks like, just looking at the data, that is a minority, which is encouraging, and more players. And again, like you said, a little bit of a bias in there because these people are invested enough to be committed to it, and they're trying to give it the best chance to succeed. So the player base, maybe the sample size is a little predetermined to wanting it to work. But again, I think it's all good signs.
Well, and I guess we should note this as well. Not only is this data probably a little bit biased, our experiences probably are as well. Yeah. A lot of these games that we were talking about were at MagicCon Chicago. That's just a naturally heavily invested player base. You are paying money to go to a really specific Magic event. You are just going to be far more deeply entrenched in, EDH as a concept than the average person. And you're probably much more likely to be tinkering with the bracket system and trying to do it correctly than somebody who is playing at LGS in, North Dakota and has no contact with anybody but their 6 friends that they play at that shop with. And so even our experiences are probably a little bit biased, and it's worth noting that.
Yeah, and to really hammer this point home, Matt, you were mentioning about some of the differences that we saw just within the bracket 4 space, where according to our original data we saw on EDHREC, probably about 15% of decks were registering at bracket 4 or higher. But then when we see users self-diagnosing, there's just 20% in bracket 4 alone. And it's especially important to notice the difference around, for instance, bracket 2. Julia's data, when we initially were looking over things, showed that 52% of decks had 0 game changers at all. But it's important to note that just because a deck contains 0 game changers does not mean that it's definitely a bracket 2. And it's cool to see that users reported only 33% total being at brackets 1 and 2. So people were, again, as you were saying, reporting upwards. They were saying, no, these things are bracket 3, even though we do see that there are not a whole lot of game changers that would necessarily indicate automatically that a deck should be bracket 3. It's nice to see what's going on there. And I think that's an even bigger example of what you were pointing out earlier that I really want to drive home.
So as we begin moving out of the kind of beta version of this bracket system in the next month or so, and we'll probably start seeing some changes to it, are there anything you guys would like to see changed or like to see not change with it as it begins transitioning into kind of the full version of this that we're going to see the limited release from what is beta?
So I know one thing I definitely do not want to see happen, and that is moving away from the exhibition level. We just had a video actually go out today as we're recording, and a lot of the comments that we saw initially were people saying, I don't know why precons just don't move down to bracket 1 because nobody's building at what bracket 1 the exhibition level is right now. But when we look at the data that we just got done looking at for the populations, 5.2% of decks are building that exhibition, that bracket 1, that the very expressive, they're just playing for fun, not trying to win actively. Whereas 4.1% of decks are CDH. And it's funny to me seeing people saying nobody's building that, but from the data that we are able to see, people are doing that more than playing CDH, and nobody's trying to get rid of CDH. And I don't think so. CDH isn't going anywhere. So seeing that initially with that feedback combined with the data we're looking at right now, I really hope that we keep bracket 1 where it's at.
Well, in that particular data point is even more startling, I think, when you really think about it.
Yeah.
Given how invested the CEDH player base is, they are much more likely to be putting their decks online and rating them and doing those things.
100%.
I would
Absolutely.
assume than people playing, ladies looking left kind of lists. So the fact that despite that, it is still the smallest slice of the pie, I think is really interesting.
I think it is important to note that there is a potential bias or flaw that could exist there. That is a place where it is susceptible for folks to under-report. While we've seen most of it seems that people are reporting upwards, it's possible that a deck that looks like a 4 could just be registered as a 4 without people labeling it specifically as a 5. It's hard to say, though. It's hard to say, though. Most of the data that we've seen so far seems to trend that people are reporting upwards, but it's possible that that isn't the case for that CEDH figure. Who knows? Regardless, though, Matt, I completely agree with you that, the bracket 1 serves a good function. When we were ranking our decks, we had a couple that we do lean specifically into flavor, so much more that we don't care how the deck is winning. And it's nice for that space to actually exist in some type of official capacity, because I think it's just, it's a good place to know what those types of things can do and for them to have an actual proper home.
One comment I saw a lot kind of related to this a little bit was whether or not Soul Ring should be a game changer. And, that would cause a lot of confusion and a lot of problems given it's been in every precon ever.
Yeah.
So
not the Jared Carthalion precon.
I don't think that will happen for that reason alone. It's just this weird thing that I think, there's a lot of reasons Soul Ring exists. The analogy I have used to get into sports ball here a little bit, one thing that baseball stadiums do is a lot of them have weird quirks. When you think of a football fields are always the same. That's not how it works in baseball. You have situations like in Boston, there's a giant green wall in left field. No other baseball stadium has an obstacle like that where you have to hit it over that wall or it bounce it off and it's a double. That's a unique thing to Boston. There's a flagpole in play in Detroit on a slope out in center field. I think those things are one of the things that make baseball interesting. Depending on where you go to play, there's going to be a little bit different variance in how the actual game functions. However, if there's 15 of those things, that causes a problem and the game is no longer baseball. Soul Ring is that one weird thing that still allows the game to be the game, but it just tweaks things a little bit. And so I am comfortable with Soul Ring being in the game because it adds some variety and everyone can experience it because it's a $1.50 card in every precon. So that's my defense of why Soul Ring, despite its power, doesn't need to be added to the game changer list.
I mean, it's kind of like what Gavin said in so many interviews since the Commander brackets were announced. Come on. It's Sol.
It's Sol Ring, right?
Like, come on. Like, come on, guys. And I agree with that. But also, I do like your analogy, Dana. Grant, I as a baseball lover myself, too, yes, Sol Ring is that one thing that kind of gives the quirk to Commander. And not to say it's an excuse in defense of Sol Ring. Sol Ring is just fine. But it also just, everybody loves doing powerful things. That's one of the biggest enablers to do powerful things and getting to play the spells in your deck to begin with. So, yeah,
everyone can do it. Everyone has equal access to
everyone can do it. If it was an expensive card, I would say sure. Yeah. But like you said, it's $1.50.
Absolutely, agree.
This episode is brought to you by Archidect. Archidect is our favorite deck building website of choice, and if you're familiar with our Upping the Average series on YouTube, you'll know I've been a big fan of this site for years now. Archidect is full of features that can take all the hassle out of deck building online. For instance, did you know you can drag and drop cards from either EDHREC or Scryfall right into Archidect, and it will add those cards to your deck for you? Whenever I brew, I already have a bunch of searches on EDHREC and Scryfall open in other tabs anyway, so literally just clicking and dragging cards right into my deck list saves me so much time. That way I don't have to type out every single dang card name. Not only that, but they also have a great system for you to create packages of cards too. If there's a group of cards that you know you're going to add to more than one deck, say a list of staples or favorite ramp effects, a counterspell or combo suite that you really enjoy and that you want to build around in more than just one list, or even just a group of pet cards, whatever the case may be, you can save those groups of cards as packages and easily add them to your decks when you're brewing, or even browse through other package ideas that other users have come up with. Archidect makes being a deck architect a total breeze. Check them out at archidekt.com.
So based on experiences so far, and I'll throw this to you, Matt, what was the general consensus on the actual game changers on the list from people you ran into or talked to? Like, were they happy with what was on there? Was there a lot of controversy regarding what wasn't on there? Did you run into anything that jumped out at you regarding the actual game changer cards?
So overall, the conversation's been really good. I think people can debate the merits of what was included, what was missed, the omissions and everything all day long. But at least it got people talking for one. I think that conversation was really good just to see from the community in general. My personal vibe is I feel like players are maybe overvaluing game changers and their presence a little bit, but at least people are paying attention to specific cards and being a little more intentional maybe.
Yeah, the definitely when it came to game changers, the thing I heard most was, yeah, I really wish this was also on the list. I didn't hear much in the way of, I'm surprised this was, and I wish they would take it off. It was almost exclusively, yeah, it'd be nice if they would add this or that. So people seemed to generally be in the headspace of adding more cards to the game changer list as opposed to taking cards off the game changer list.
Yeah, that vibes with my experience as well, Dana, especially folks asking about green and red, which have very few game changers right now. Stuff like Deflecting Swat, Worldly Tutor are some cards that have been mentioned widely as possibilities that could be put on there. Mana Drain, Necropotence, Teferi's Protection are also some others.
Yeah.
I appreciate them starting off with something small to like, let's undershoot a little rather than, overdo a little bit too much and make it overwhelming for people. The exact final composition of the game changer list is a subject of some debate, but as a bird's eye view observation about the game changer concept in general, I take this all as a very good sign, like you were saying too, Dana, because conversation seems most often to form around what could be on the list rather than expressing frustration with the concept of the list in general, which signals to me that this whole premise is pretty good and grokkable and a foundation to continue to work off of rather than being like a failed launch point right out of the gate. And kind of going off of that, as another broad observation about the game changer list, I'll note that my current feeling or feedback is that the list could probably stand to be expanded a little bit. And maybe we can discuss the game changer specifically for a moment before going back to some other proposed changes that we've seen people talk about. And one of the reasons I think adding some more cards to the list could be helpful, I've actually mentioned one thing on a previous episode. With the current list, it's a little more difficult for the average player to identify, especially monocolored bracket 4 optimized decks, particularly in green. My hope for a bracket 4 deck optimized is that it should probably be pretty hard to you shouldn't be able to yoink out one game changer and then potentially go masquerading as a bracket 2. And given our data from before, we do see that players appear to be self-reporting their decks upward rather than falsifying downward, which is a good sign. But a few more cards on the list could help players not always have to report upward. Of course, expanding the game changer list comes with the potential downside of it being harder to remember what's on it, so there is probably only so far that it can go, but the list could encompass a couple other cards that do hint at gameplay elements that aren't always suitable to be played against precon level decks at bracket 2.
See, I want to agree with you, Joey, that they're cards that I feel uncomfortable playing against precons, but then precons have gotten very, very powerful the past few years too. So I am even dating back to the video that we did where I was bracketing my decks, the Mishra precon, which is all old border. That deck, compared to modern day precons that are just coming out this year, doesn't hold a candle to what precons are doing now. So I think it's really hard to justify not playing any game changers ever against precon level decks, because precons, like especially lately, have gotten just so stinking powerful. Like you could play a Bumbleflower deck and probably even say like, I'm gonna add 2 cards in this bracket 4.
I don't feel the same way about that Bumbleflower analogy, but to your main point, there have been some spicy precons for sure. A Bumbleflower, Vagavoth, Stella Lee are certainly very powerful right out the box. But then I also look at the most recent batch of precons from Aetherdrift, and that energy deck is
that was a wet fart of a precon deck. I do agree with you there.
It's kind of a hot mess.
It is, yeah.
Right, and I think the Thunder Junction Gonti deck suffered a bit out of the box too. I guess to me, the modern precon quality, it's definitely improved, but it is still pretty swingy. So the idea of no game changers at bracket 2 is a clean line I appreciate, and I think there are still some more cards that help enable game warping plays that are kind of beyond the scope of an imprecise precon average to be able to deal with. I think there are more of those types of cards than the present list currently represents. So it sounds like that's a point that you and I just happen to differ on. Another thing that you and I have discussed too, Matt, is that the current loadout of game changer cards, it airs a lot towards CEDH signifiers like Thassa's Oracle, Moxen, Ad Nauseam, a lot of things like that, which is why there are so few green cards on the list right now.
Yeah.
The things that make green powerful socially are not the things that make green powerful competitively. And for red, a lot of the game changer cards that red would play are honestly a lot of those game changer artifacts like the One Ring, or a lot of red's competitive strengths have been addressed in a different way already.
Yeah, I had a few problems with how many red cards were on the game changer list because there weren't very many at all. But then a lot of what would have been game changers for red ended up just being on the mass land denial list. So I've kind of come to peace a little bit with why red doesn't have very many cards, because Blood Moon is mass land denial, stuff like that.
Right. All of that makes a lot of sense. It doesn't sound like any of us feel as though the colors red and green need to have an even number of game changers as the other colors. Honestly, it does make sense to me why there are more blue and black cards on the list than there are red and green cards. But it does seem like we all do feel that there are some cards that could stand to be on that game changers list that aren't there yet, including in red and green. So before we get back to some other proposals that we've heard about, ways that the system could be altered overall, do we want to pause for a moment to propose some cards that we would hope to see as potential future game changers?
So as a green player myself, I still don't know how Great Henge is not a game changer. It does not make sense the more and more that I've thought about it. It's just one of the most powerful cards, whereas Trouble in Pairs, all being on the list, I don't get it.
Oh, really? I guess we just disagree there. I like Trouble in Pairs on the list, and there are a couple other green cards that I would prioritize before Great Henge.
But how many are played at like commonly is the thing? Because I know there's a lot of cards that you could put on there. Like I know the Earthcraft is one that everybody knows how it combos with everything. When was the last time you saw an Earthcraft at a table though?
Yeah, the ubiquity for me made a huge difference. Like there are definitely busted cards out there, but I don't know if we need to really worry about putting them on the game changers list. Like, I don't think Tabernacle of Pendrell Vale needs to be in the game changers list.
No.
Number one, you know exactly how powerful that card is if you're one of the 14 people that owns a copy. and it's irrelevant for everybody else for the most part. And like I think Earthcraft falls in that category a little bit versus something like Seabar Muse. I think actually even more than the Great Henge is one that I feel like in green is pretty ubiquitous. It's good in every single deck. It's really, really powerful. Like that's the kind of thing I would not mind seeing added to the game changer list. Necropotence is one that I wouldn't mind seeing added to the game changer list. Again, the ubiquity, easy to get a hold of, easy to slap into almost any black deck and have be effective. Mana Drain in blue is one of those ones.
Yeah.
It's an absolute bomb. It can change the course of the game. I guess it's kind of expensive, but like it's not in the reserve list. So like it can constantly be showing up in reprint sets. It's very, very powerful. So that's the one thing for me that jumps out is how frequently the card is actually going to show up combined with the power versus just the power.
Yeah, how much is a card going to show up definitely impacts my opinion on if a card should be a game changer or not.
I feel you on the ubiquity argument. Dana, you noted the least popular game changer, Tabernacle. That shows up in barely 8,000 decks. And having cards on the list that don't actually show up much, that can seem a little perfunctory for sure. So I think I feel you on that. For my part, at least, the ubiquity isn't quite as strong a focus for me. Glacial Chasm, for instance, shows up in just 1% of decks that are eligible to play it, but I like naming it as a game changer. Maybe this is just my bias, just my taste in tea, but I think my focus is kind of on that term, game changer, as in this is a card that has shifted the tone of the game, or it had a warping effect, especially a very early ability to alter the trajectory of a game.
Yeah.
That's why I totally agree with you, Dana, that Necropotence and Mana Drain feel very appropriate for the list. I think they fit that description. And kind of wrapped in that as another metric for me on what could be a game changer too, those are also cards that kind of make me feel uncomfortable to play against precon level decks. When it comes to green cards, the ones that draw my attention that fit that description, Dana, you mentioned Seedborn Muse. That's also a CEDH card, so I could see that one. I think also maybe something like Hermit Druid. That one really supercharges a graveyard deck. To me, it does feel like there's a difference between a deck that does graveyard things versus a deck doing Hermit Druid things. You know, there are some instances where you pull a Jimmy Wong on game nights and you get nothing from a Hermit Druid, but then there are some moments where you pull a Kathleen DeVere on game nights and get so much value from a Hermit Druid that you are unstoppable and it takes over a game. Stuff like that has sometimes the potential to produce a non-game, I guess, is how I would characterize where my focus falls for potential future game changers and for green. I think that's why I don't put my priority on a card like Great Henge. You know, the Great Henge is indeed a great card, but I think precons maybe wouldn't hate playing against it, whereas something like a Constant Mists, which is a green buyback fog, that one feels to me like it kind of mimics some of the problems that Glacial Chasm produces, where it can be a bad experience for decks that are not prepared for it. Maybe a way to say it is that Henge makes green more green, while like Mists or Muse make green more blue. And maybe that's why I think that they're more of a concern to me. I guess I would expect upgraded decks at Bracket 3 to be prepared for a card like Constant Mists, but I wouldn't necessarily expect that of decks that are at Bracket 2.
Constant Mists to me it's an interesting case study for sure. I'm glad that you mentioned that card, Joey. I see why it is really hard to get around, and once people are able to set up around it, it's oppressive. The problem is setting up is kind of a process for sure. So if you can disrupt it enough, whereas Glacial Chasm, you don't need to take turns off. You don't have to save your mana for it like you do with a Constant Miss. So there is a little bit of a difference, but I do really like the conversation around Constant Miss.
Yeah, I feel you on that. To wrap up some of the remaining ones we've collected in the show notes here, Matt, you mentioned seeing some more in red potentially, and Deflecting Swat has certainly been on the tip of a lot of tongues out there. That's a card where I'll admit I do sometimes feel a little duplicitous when I have it in hand. Or in white, we've mentioned a lot of folks have named Teferi's Protection too, which I think I've also come around on thinking that, yeah, that could stand to be a game changer. The decks where I'm playing that card do hit pretty hard, and it does feel like by putting that card into my deck, I am intending to do the Bracket 3 experience, I suppose.
Sure.
And I've probably named Phyrexian Altar before too, sacrificing creatures for mana. That one's a bit more complicated. I would actually bet that a lot of cards end up staying off of the game changer list because they are so explicitly combo enablers, like Food Chain, or Matt, you mentioned Earthcraft earlier. And since infinite combos already have a dedicated description within the bracket system, cards that are so classically combo pieces don't need to be named outright on that list. But I think maybe a card like Phyrexian Altar, which isn't always a combo enabler, but which can be, and which also kind of launches some strategies into the higher and harder to interact with gears. That's the kind of thing that I think could be healthy to have on this type of radar when helping a deck to differentiate between whether it's a bracket 2 or 3.
See, my only concern with the ever-growing list of game changers that I've kind of, maybe I've gotten a little more entrenched on is, when do we kind of draw the line of what card is too powerful to let other people play? Because then you kind of restrict where people can play a lot of decks. And to me, it's being able to get a little more free-flowing. And do people want to play against powerful cards or powerful decks? And they're not always hand in hand. So it's definitely a weird line that I'm not envious of the format panel and having to navigate, because yeah, people will play this format to play powerful cards. And so suddenly regulating them and saying you have to play it only with other high level power decks, and maybe you don't want to do that. You just want to play a powerful card. It's a weird line to walk.
The one thing I will note about that, I think this is very much a vibes thing, I guess, so it's hard to quantify.
Yeah,
but like,
for sure.
People tend to, I think, react less negatively to a deck that happens to be powerful because it has a lot of synergy or works well together than they do feeling like they lost to a certain card. I think a powerful card creates a feel-bad situation more often than just a deck that like plays really well together and winds up being a powerful deck.
But then is it a power bracket? Is it actually like bracketing like how powerful the decks are? Or is it bracketing like how powerful an individual card in your deck is? And that goes back to my biggest flaw with the original, hypothetically proposed system back in October. Was your bracket is as high as the most powerful card in your deck, which was a huge flaw. And we're kind of tiptoeing around going back to that by making every single card a game changer, unless it's an annul or whatever. Like that's the most powerful counterspell in your deck, which I don't know. It sits weird with me.
Well, I hope I've not given the impression that I want every staple or strong card to be a game changer. I don't feel that way, and I don't want like 80 or 100 cards on that list. And frankly, even the fact that some cards might be unbanned and turned into game changers eats up some of the space on that list too, So if it is coming off like I want the list to swell up to that size, then maybe I need to be communicating better. Because as you say, big, splashy, exciting cards are the whole point of why we're playing EDH. All I'm trying to say is that I think the list could probably stand to be expanded because there are a few things that I don't think it accounts for just yet. I think to something that Brian Kibler has remarked upon, that what he likes most from this entire Brackets enterprise is the Game Changers list. It succinctly allows players to mention some pretty sick stuff that their decks can do. And that's what I like too. We've done whole episodes about cards that feel way better to play and to play against when the table's been given a quick heads up about them, where it feels like the gameplay they create is honored in moments where people know what they're in for.
Yeah.
It's honestly very cool to be able to say bracket 4 deck and instantly know that this is a deck that is ready to throw down even against the likes of mass land denial. So the cards that I think deserve to be taken aim at inclusion on the list aren't just powerful staples, but hopefully cards that can kind of serve as canaries in the coal mine, cards that indicate additional intention about that deck's mission, because that part about intention, especially in the socially focused areas of the bracket system, is what I think still needs the most fleshing out, and that players may need more assistance to understand or navigate intuitively.
Yeah, and promoting more discussion is always good. Getting those pregame conversations, I'm 100% here for, no matter what form or fashion that takes. Just around the game changers, especially like I said at the beginning of the show, I think folks are overvaluing them a little bit. But overall, again, if it gets people talking, if it gets people getting to converse with each other before the game and just communicate in general, then it's still a win no matter how big or small the game changer list is.
Yeah. I completely agree with both those statements.
Yeah. The idea of it is itself the thing that is worth praising here, and it could have plenty of fluctuations. One last thing that I've also posited as a potential thing here is like playing with the actual threshold of game changers that are allowed. Do you guys like the number 3? Would you want to see that number change? Would you want it to go down? Would you want it to go up? Like if you had to make an official declaration about it, should that number stay where it's at or change?
To me, at least 3 felt like a number where I was forced to make decisions. Whether or not I could very easily have put 4 game changers in this particular deck, but I can't. Because it doesn't feel like a 4 deck. It feels like a powerful 3, but if I'm playing in the 4 space, I'm going to have problems with the things that 4 decks do. Therefore, I have to make a choice. That felt right to me, and if you were to allow 4 or 5 game changers, I felt like it would not force me to make tough choices, and I like having to make tough choices. So for me, it seems like those numbers worked out nicely.
So to me, the game changer list and the amount of numbers in there in any given deck, that's just a dial on all the different things they can tinker with. And to me, that should be the absolute last thing that they mess with when it comes to getting the commander brackets out of beta. I want to see things like the game changer list itself clearly defined and close to finalized. I want to see some of the rules around where things are allowed before the amount of game changers per deck comes into play. Because we even talked about before, what if we let a game changer into brackets 2 decks? Well, that's going to change a lot depending on what becomes a game changer, and if the game changer list is 80 cards or if it stays close to 40. So there's so many different things going on. This is the last thing I would tinker with when it comes to what it looks like when the commander bracket system comes out of the beta stage.
It's so interesting. Dana, you said that 3 felt like the right number for you to have to make some proper decisions about your decks and where they lie. To me, I didn't quite have that same experience. I had a lot of decks that I was very sure are bracket 3s that I felt like some of the cards in this deck should really be registering as like a game changer to help me better be able to identify this. I think part of what is informing my opinion here is that data that we saw earlier, where a lot of players appear to be reporting upwards. A lot more players are registering as, I'm declaring my deck as a bracket 3 upgraded, than necessarily the amount of game changers we're seeing that people are actually playing regularly. So that indicates to me that the list itself is maybe not expansive enough. To me, depending on the size of the game changer list, it could be a variable that could move around.
Yeah, if the game changer list suddenly balloons up to 80 cards, I don't think that would ever happen, because that's so many cards to keep track of in a separate list. But if it did, I think 3 would not be enough. I would like to see the game changer list go up, or the game changer amount in a bracket 3 deck go up, because if you're making a bigger and bigger list of restricted cards, it suddenly turns into people are going to use it as a shield of like, I don't want to play against any given card, and that feels very weird to me, and it almost like segregates it in a negative way.
That's so interesting. To me, I don't want 80 or 100 cards on that list. But with the list as it currently is, if it did just stay, like, let's say we have exactly the same 40, I would want to see the game changer threshold move down to 2 cards instead of 3 cards.
Okay.
I think it does need a little bit of expansion to justify being at the 3 mark. So it's interesting to see our differences there.
And I guess I will also note the fact that I had Ancient Tomb in so many decks makes that the hard decision.
Probably did bias you a little bit. Yeah.
Narrows things down a little bit for me, particularly.
I mean, Dana, that just means you have so many cards that you can send it on Card Sphere and get
That's
so much credit
true.
to build new decks. There you go.
That's very, very true.
Here's a question I haven't been able to make up my mind about, and I'd love to hear from you guys on. There are currently some tutors on the game changer list, like Vamp Tutor, Demonic Tutor, Mystical Tutor, etc. However, the list also says that brackets 1 and 2, players shouldn't expect lots of tutors as a category in general. So from a certain point of view, those types of cards are kind of double covered. It is named as a category, but then also some explicit and exceptional standouts of that category are on the game changer list. And to contrast against that, the game changer list does not include any masked land denial cards, because those are already covered by the clause for that entire category of card only showing up at bracket 4+. Do you think it would be useful or wise to make those things, tutors and mass land denial, more similar to each other in that way? Like, for example, would you want to remove those tutors from the game changer list to free up space on that list, so to speak, and to make that whole category a more explicit thing across the bracket system image? Perhaps even if they said like cheap tutors, 1 or 2 mana tutors as a hypothetical category, and they treated that the same way as mass land denial is currently treated, and it didn't need to have any specific examples on the list anymore. Is that something you'd be in favor of? Do you think that would be messy? I am curious what you think.
So I haven't had a chance to really play around with that too much yet. So I don't have a strong opinion one way or another. I would like to see how it is, but they did explicitly say, like you mentioned, Joey, that they say few tutors. They're trying to cut down on those bracket 1 and 2, and then the mass land denial kind of rolls everything up, because I think by definition, Blood Moon should be a game changer, and so they're hoping that it gets taken care of with that mass land denial list. So I understand why they didn't, because it is kind of weird that in Worldly Tutor is not a game changer, but Demonic Tutor is. It's kind of weird, but I think for anything more, I think players want consistency when it comes to this. So it's an all or nothing instead of, well, we're going to lean on the category here, but not for this one card. So that's where I think for players, it gets kind of tricky.
The consistency is what jumps out at me for sure, Matt. I'm very much with you there. I am okay with having no mass land destruction on the game changers list if it's an implicit game changer. Like, just, you're not running mass land destruction in these brackets because of this reason, therefore we don't need to mention Armageddon or Blood Moon or whatever. Something similar has been said, efficient tutors, but they then also have some of those tutors in the game changer list. So I would agree to take them off and just like treat them like they do mass land destruction. This is a thing that you don't run outside of bracket 4. Therefore, we don't need to have them in the game changer list taking up space, and we can use those slots to put some additional cards that maybe should be on there.
Yeah, I think the more that I consider it, the more I'm like, I would like to see that potentially used. And maybe it's another way that could help differentiate between brackets 2 and 3. Like maybe that could be a space or whatever. But like I think it does that could be a way of freeing up some space on the game changer list. But it's thank you for sharing your opinions, because it was something I was still like turning over, still needed to figure out.
I guess my only last thought about game changers in general is, like I said, if people are overvaluing it, it feels like people act like they can't build powerful decks without them, and that's definitely not the case. People definitely still can be building these bracket 3 and bracket 4 decks, but, well, I just don't want to play against this one card, so I'm just going to say it's a bracket 2 and not playing a game changers myself. That's something I've seen several people online doing, and I don't love that behavior.
Yeah.
And so again, the relationship with game changers, it's so fresh. It's just going to take time to adjust. I don't know what the exact solution is, but just giving people time to kind of navigate those conversations more and more and just get more familiar will definitely help. And I think that really is kind of the only cure that we can hope for.
Yeah. And getting the conversation out there too, right? Because as you noted, this is still so new that it's not a thing that is coming up necessarily super frequently in discussion, and hopefully it can.
Yeah, when we're recording this, it's less than a month old still.
Yeah, which is, it's wild to think that like it hasn't even been a month yet.
Yeah, and within the next month, it does seem like Wizards is going to be moving to finalize this, officialize it, move it out of beta, and hopefully they've gotten quite a lot of feedback. We hope that the data in this episode has been interesting to folks out there, but also that will be interesting to the folks who are on that Commander format panel to help elucidate and make decisions about where this system can go and what to do with it a little bit easier, to make things more possible to generate positive discussion and to create a system that really does help unify that starting place of a pregame discussion.
So do both of you think that it's been a bigger part of the pregame conversation than it hasn't been? So like if you had to give like a percentage of how many people have started off with, okay, it's bracket X and then gone from there, what would you estimate it has been at then?
I would say compared to, let's say Chicago last year, roughly the same time, but there was no bracket. There were more pregame conversations this year, and I think the bracket system forced people to maybe have a conversation they weren't even having last year.
Sure.
And they were not saying anything maybe last year. This year they'd say, it's my bracket 3, and because they were already having the mentioning what the bracket is, that then forced them to say something else. Not every time, but like a noticeable amount of times, and I would say more than I was seeing it happen last year.
Yeah, in Chicago, I noticed it probably in about half the games that I played, which admittedly I didn't play many games in Chicago, to be honest. But then back home, most of my playing has been with local play group where like we already know stuff, so we haven't needed to. But again, the system is not devised for the local play group who already knows. It's devised to help out when there is a mystery to the discussion, or when the discussion has not been had, or that history doesn't exist. So for the games out in the wild, I noticed probably about half of them were there, and they did seem to help.
Yeah, and Joey, you touched on kind of one of my big pieces of criticism into the bracket system, and I think it wasn't purely the bracket system itself, but you mentioned this wasn't really meant for playgroups that already know each other, have that established relationship. I've seen so many people try to use this prescriptively, and mostly with the online crowd. When I see it in execution with just various players and kind of doing everything day to day, it's not that much of an issue, but people have kind of said like, no, this is exactly how it is, when, like Dana, you mentioned, this is a tool. This is something that gives kind of a common language for everybody to use and clearly defines everything, versus this is the end all be all.
Now, the game changers list is the thing that I think people default to more than anything else when it comes to defining what bracket their deck belongs into. There's definitely those folks that are like, well, this is a 2 because I have no game changers, therefore, no matter how it plays, it's a 2. I've run into a couple of those for sure. And to a degree, I do understand that. I think it's worth mentioning when your deck, even if your deck plays beyond what the bracket indicates, I do think it's worth mentioning it is technically a bracket 2 or technically a bracket 3 or whatever it is, because that does mean something. When someone tells you their deck is a bracket 2, it means there's not going to be a Cyclonic Rift in it, or there's not going to be a Fierce Guardianship in it. Like, you will at least roughly know what cards will not be present. I think that is useful. I think it's also useful to then note the fact that, but it probably plays like a 3. I think I find that to be very useful for me personally. Number one, to say what the bracket is specifically based on card content and intent, but then note the reality of how it plays, because the bracket system doesn't deal with things like synergy, or doesn't deal with things like game plan, or how, if you've had a deck for 5 years, you've probably trimmed almost all of the fat off that list. Even if it isn't in the form of fantastic cards, it's in the form of 20 minor upgrades that have turned it from something that works well to something that works like a perfectly tuned automobile. And it's worth making that note, but it's also worth making the note that there aren't certain cards found in this list too.
The way I've been saying that is a game changer list 3 is how I've been characterizing it.
Yeah.
Which I think is probably important to put the focus there, personally.
Sure.
Because how it plays and like that deck intent is also supposed to be a big focus of the system.
Yeah, for sure.
Even though that's still something that probably needs more clarity from Wizards when this all does move out of beta.
Well, and I like what you said, Dana, about synergy, because there's a video that somebody was shooting at MagicCon Chicago. I know, Joey, you and we had a couple segments on there, but Cody, who over at Power Budget TCG at the YouTube channel, we'll link the video in the description below, did a really good job at interviewing a bunch of people and asked Kibler about some feedback. And he said pretty much that exact same thing that you did, Dan, about synergy, where the bracket doesn't communicate synergy between cards very well. And it's really important when understanding the power level of decks. Because Dana, you always build highly synergistic decks.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And they're going to play better than what the bracket indicates they would be really, really often. But I also think it's useful to tell people in advance, it's going to play this way, but you're not going to see these cards too. So the more information you can give, and they will know what cards won't be present in just a little shorthand, that's really, really useful, even if you have to expand on it to set the expectation.
Yeah, again, cheers to that video. It was really cool. Cody interviewed over 20 different creators out there to get their takes on the system, and a general positive vibe seemed to be had by a whole lot of folks out there, especially when noting how this can be used as just one extra thing that you can start off a pregame discussion with, and that being helpful. A particular observation that I wanted to point out from that video too was when he interviewed the creator Maldhound, and Maldhound had a very funny anecdote. He noticed that even when people were using the system ironically, like they were trying to act a little bit too cool for it, and they said it's like, oh, like a soft 3, even though they were ironically using the bracket system, everyone did kind of understand what that means, and then the game was fun. And so I thought that was a particularly important thing to share. I was like, oh, I really like that, because that also kind of lines up with my experience here, and I think that's kind of heartening.
Yeah, you're still giving folks a reference point and still giving a little bit of thought. So yeah, even if you're mocking it, like, you're still at least participating in that conversation and using that tool. So I mean, if it works, it works.
Yeah, that's something I think we said when we have talked about this previously. Just the act of knowing roughly what that means. When someone said my deck was a 6, you didn't really know what that meant. When someone tells you their deck is a 2, well, you know that there's not going to be a bunch of extra turns in it. You know there's not going to be game changers in it. You know there's not going to be 2-card combos in it. Like you don't know exactly how it's going to play, but you have a much better idea of what that means than someone said their deck was a 6, 6 months ago.
Yeah. Well, to kind of circle back to some of the other things that we've seen people propose as possible big sweeping changes to the system, a prominent one that there's been some chatter about is the number of brackets overall. Some folks have proposed additional brackets for various reasons. For instance, one that we've seen is the idea of bracket 6, all cards being legal, nothing is banned, which sounds like a fun idea to me. If you want to play no bans with a group, I say go for it. Yeah. But also to me, that sounds like the kind of thing that doesn't need to be officialized by Wizards for people to do it.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's me talking a lot. That's just my immediate impression. What do you guys think? What would your feedback be about those types of expanding the brackets proposals?
Having a no ban list commander sounds like the ideal thing to do with your established play group, where you don't need to have the rule 0 conversation. It's something fun you do with your friends, because that's self-contained. Bracket 6, I struggle to think that would catch on for the player base at large, because a lot of folks just need rules, and especially going into something like MagicCon Chicago or MagicCon Las Vegas coming up in June, we need rules in place to kind of protect that unknown experience, where I think bracket 6 very much would fall apart in that. But again, this is a tool. The bracket system is a tool to supplement and give everybody common language. If you don't need that, then absolutely do a no ban list commander night with your friends.
Yeah. Well, in Matt, you're noting that it is a tool. For me, is the big thing that I want to see emphasized. I think that needs to be made just so clear to the player base that this is not replacing anything. This is just some other piece of language for you to use in that pregame conversation that allows you to succinctly sum up what your deck is trying to do and roughly what cards it contains or doesn't contain. I think making it clear that this is just something to add on to what you're already doing is something I want to see the rules committee continue to like hammer and continue to try to spread the gospel of to the greater player base.
Another thing that I've seen suggested is basically creating another space between brackets 2 and 3. And in our initial video about this, I think this is something that I talked about myself and then eventually talked myself out of. I tend to operate in a space of game changer list 3s.
Yeah.
Like I build a lot of decks that are upgraded from precons, but I'm still not playing any of those game changer style cards, the Cyclonic Rifts, the Ristic Studies, the Survival of the Fittest, any of those. But the more that I thought about it, the less I felt like I needed a specific place to identify that. And even just being able to say Game Changer List 3 was already helpful to me. So creating another space between those, I don't think it would be necessary as much to me. I do get why people are saying it. A lot of folks feel that if they are themselves not going to engage with bracket 1 or bracket 5, then they just have 3 brackets to choose from. And then that causes the middle bracket to feel like a default middle, and it feels like my deck is a 7 kind of point. To me, I've just found the 5 brackets so immediately grokkable, and I've become so wary of trying to add more gradients to it, like adding another bracket or saying things like 2.5 or low 4 or stuff like that, that it feels like trying to add more stuff in here feels like it would just get too close to the old 1 through 10 system that we kind of want to avoid. I don't know how you guys feel about that, but to me, I think keeping the 5 brackets that we have actually ends up being a good number. Do you feel similarly? Would you enjoy another space between those? Where are you at that one?
I think the 5 bracket system with CEDH being one, it works well because then it still gives the social aspect of the format 4 data points. There isn't that central data point that Gavin said specifically. I don't want to have a middle point because that means the bell curve is then going to gravitate towards the middle. So the population is doing that a little bit with the numbers that we are seeing. But yeah, I definitely think that 5 is the right number, and maybe just some better language around the intent again of bracket 2, bracket 3 to help people kind of sort things out. And I think once people get more comfortable with game changers and their relationship with decks, being able to put, okay, well, I don't have any game changers, but it still is a bracket 4. That was a conversation I had to have with myself too. So I think it'll get a little bit more spread out as people get more comfortable and just more experience with the bracket system itself.
When we had first talked about this, Joey and I both had made the point that like, oh, maybe it would be useful to allow 1 game changer in bracket 2 or something. We both kind of stepped back from that when we talked about potential unbans a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
And I am fully off that now.
Yeah.
Like that was my initial reaction. And then thinking about how the removing cards from ban list would affect it has changed my thought process. And now just having seen this in use, I just don't think we need that delineation between or that blurring of the lines between 2 and 3. I think it's prior to having experienced it, I thought maybe we could have some overlap. Having seen it, I think it works really good the way it is. And I think allowing a single game changer into bracket 2 is just going to serve to muddy the waters versus trying to like let you play something a little more powerful at that level. Mm-hmm. I think if you want to, you can have that Rule 0 conversation. Hey, this is my, tomb deck and I'm going to run an ancient tomb in it. Like people, you can have that conversation. But I think allowing that exception is something that I've definitely changed my mind on, and I like that separation as it stands right now.
Agreed. A final point that I think is, again, really important to hammer home. I just want to come back around to that, not quite metaphor, but like that phrasing that you had earlier, Matt, of just reminding that this is a comma and not a period, and that this being just an extra tool is a very helpful thing to see. So as many small criticisms or changes that we could hope to see or things that we hope don't change, all of these little nuances, I hope that does not make us lost in the overall field of we do generally like this. We've had positive experiences with it so far, especially when it is being used not as the end of a discussion, but as an ingredient in a discussion. So just I wanted to end with a thumbs up kind of feeling, I guess.
we've made great strides so far, and I would imagine when we check back on this in, post Vegas, post Atlanta, this time next year, every single time we look back on it, we are going to see that it's been used by a large amount of people, and it's been used correctly by those people, or at least more in line with the goal of just increasing the conversation and making for better games.
Yeah, for sure. Like we mentioned, this is only a month old. So as we get more familiar with it, it's just going to keep getting better and better. This is not the final version. That's another thing that just folks need to remember. This is a beta. It's going to change. And from what we've seen so far, like hopefully we can expect to think that it's only going to change for the better.
With that, guys, I think we're going to call this episode to a close. So if any of our listeners would like to get in touch with us, where is it that they can find us online if they have even more feedback about this system? Matt?
So you can find me on pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, we are proud to be joining forces with Dragon Shield to bring you just some of the best deck protection accessories, whether it's sleeve boxes, anything like that. And don't forget, check out their website coming up soon for some custom EDHRECast sleeves in the very near future.
Heck yeah. And Dana?
I am Dana. You can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald. And you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And you can find me everywhere online, from Instagram to Blue Sky at Joseph M. Schultz. And you can find the cast online at EDHRECast. Plus, if you've got any other questions for us, or perhaps a challenge to stat submission that you'd like to submit, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.